Good morning and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, depending on where you are. So we welcome all of you to this high-level webinar on tackling gender-based violence, economic consequences and solutions, organized in collaboration with the IMF and UN Women. Thank you so much for joining us. Let me introduce myself. My name is Dina Virapen. I'm the Program Officer at the Africa Training Institute based in Mauritius. So let me cover some housekeeping issues while referring to the slide that is now being shown. As you can see here, the event is being live streamed on the social media of IMF. You'll be able to watch the event on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter, and also on the IMF webpage. Moving to the next slide. So some guidelines about the language interpretation services. For laptop and desktop users, please click on the interpretation icon, as you can see here, the globe sign found at the bottom of the screen. You then need to select the language you would like to hear from the language options available, that is English, French, or Portuguese. For mobile users, in your meeting controls, you need to tap More. You click on language interpretation again, then you select the language you would like to hear from the language options available. Moving to the next slide. So we have here some webinar guidelines. Your microphone and camera will not be available during the webinar. Please post questions in the Q&A window to all panelists. Please write your name, affiliation, and country before your question. Please also indicate, as far as possible, which presenter your question is intended for, so if you have any preference. Thank you so much for your attention. Now, without any further ado, I would like to invite Ms. Lisa Kolovic to moderate the session. So thank you very much, Lisa. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dina. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of our speakers and audience for joining us today for what promises to be a thought-provoking discussion on tackling gender-based violence. I'm Lisa Kolovic. I'm an economist at the IMF, and I have the privilege of moderating today's event. I also have the honor of introducing two esteemed colleagues who will provide opening remarks. Maxime Wunato has served as the UN Women Regional Director for East and Southern Africa region since September of 2021. Previously, he was the UN Women's country representative in Uganda. And prior to that, he served as UN Women's Deputy Regional Director of the West and Central Africa region, spending 6 years in Dakar and 4 years as the country representative in Mali. He has been an active member of the UN Regional Quality and Support Assurance Team and a key contributor to UN's Deliver as One model. Maxime holds a Master of Business Administration from Abomi Kalavi University, a Master of Arts in International Development from Brandeis University, and a doctorate in Applied Sociology from Sheikh Anta Diop University. Ms. Ratna Sahai is the Senior Advisor on Gender in the Office of the Managing Director at the International Monetary Fund. She is responsible for mainstreaming gender in the Core's fund activities, including surveillance, programs, and capacity development. Prior to this role as Senior Advisor, she was a Deputy Director in the IMF's Monetary and Capital Markets Department. She has worked in several regional departments in the IMF and has previously served as an advisor to Stanley Fischer, who was the first Deputy Managing Director, and Michael Musa and Kenneth Rogoff, who were both economic counselors at the IMF. She has published widely in leading journals, and she has taught at Delhi University, Columbia University, and New York University, and holds a PhD in economics from New York University. And so with that, Dr. Wunato, the floor is yours.
Dr. Wunato, can you hear us?
Hi, Dina, she's joining right now.
Okay, yeah, I can see him online. Yes.
Okay.
Superb.
Okay.
Yes. this is fine. You can proceed. Thank you.
Life that is not affected by gender norms. Thus, that first iteration of the course only covered some of the pertinent aspects related to women's participation and contribution to the economy. It is therefore with a lot of excitement that UN Women and IMF have together delivered this course, further teasing out some of the pertinent aspects of gender and economics nexus. Working on the premises that human beings are rational actors and individuals will behave in a way that is beneficially most often only to them, it is clear that, and it's demonstrated in many aspects throughout this course, that economic policies have the power to influence and indeed also to change human behavior. In some cases, it can be argued that economic policies can be more powerful at achieving behavioral change than other projects aimed at changing gender norms in society. No economy is spared from the cost of gender-based violence. As most of us know, 1 in 3 women globally experience physical or sexual violence in their lifetime, and most often from somebody they share an intimate relationship with. This does not include girls under 15. That is, another ballgame altogether. So gender inequality has a real cost to the economy, and this cost can be measured and quantified. There are many studies recently that will show you the cost of gender-based violence in the economy, with UN estimating the global cost for GBV at approximately 2% of gross domestic product globally, which is about 1.5 trillion US dollars, larger than the entire economy of many countries on this continent. So there are also costs, benefits in investing in prevention of violence against women. So in addition to avoiding losses, there are also financial gains to be realized. In one study done by UN Women, it was found that the annual GDP loss due to GBV gap in agricultural, gender gap in agricultural productivity was about 100 million for Malawi, 105 million for Tanzania, and 67 million for Uganda. Therefore, while the general assumption usually is that gender issues are social issues, they have direct quantifiable implications for the economy and growth, and ultimately also on poverty reduction. In some cases, we have seen that we are challenged in quantifying the full extent of the cost of gender inequality because some of our data collection systems are developed in a gender-blind manner. Through this course, for instance, you will have seen that shortcomings in the global labor force survey protocols commonly carried out in our countries as the labor force survey that have been inadequately carried out, for example, in capturing the contribution of unpaid care work to the economy, or the impacts of women's unpaid care burden on the labor force participation, and therefore the potential job that could be created if we were to invest in creating jobs in the care sector. Similarly, there are real costs to the economy and to individuals from the lost productivity due to violence, and controlling behaviors is another invisible cost that is not yet factored in the figures that we see today. Societal attitudes and norms, which are introduced from a young age and reinforced in relationship, in families, in communities, often inhibits some women from even considering to start a business. Systemic barriers mean that even those that start businesses stay confined in a very small business, often operated in the informal economy, which has been shown to place women at greater risk of violence and exploitation due to lack of measures to protect their rights. This not only limits their ability to earn an income for themselves and for their family, but also it impedes them from realizing their full potential to contribute to economic development, job creation, and economic growth. As we have noticed, women tend to work in the informal sector, either in small informal enterprises or just as employees. So despite their small annual turnovers, the number of these women-owned micro enterprises is very large, particularly in Africa, and their potential is tremendous. Take, for instance, the example of cross-border trade, where informal women make up to 70% of intra-Africa trades in the continent. We know that globally, 740 million women are in the informal sector today, where the lack of policies, appropriate policies, leads to income insecurity, vulnerable employment, and higher risk of gender-based violence. Each of these social phenomena has real cost to the economy, and we do not need to wait to see more data before we take action. It is my challenge to you today, each one of you, as you leave this course, to apply what you have learned here in your work beyond this course. It is to think about how the policies that you are part of creating, part of implementing or refining, how they reach and include those who are the most marginalized. Through this course and the discussions this afternoon, we have the space to take perspective from those who might not be in these rooms with us, those without the power to shape policies that affect their own lives, such as those in the informal sector, those individuals who are outside of the formally recognized labor force. Our access to this privileged space, ladies and gentlemen, brings with it an obligation to serve the people of Africa, so that each person, regardless of their gender identity, can contribute to their communities with their full potential, free from violence and free from discrimination. As UN Women, we look very much forward to further collaboration with the IMS and all of you to further these events today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Radna, please. The floor is yours.
Yes, Ms. Ratnasai, you can please proceed. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. That was a very, very effective and a realistic speech by Dr. Maxime. I couldn't agree more with him. So let me now turn to just welcoming all of you to this high-level seminar on tackling what is a parallel pandemic that is invisible, the shadow pandemic of gender-based violence. We have just ended the first delivery of a course on gender equality and macroeconomics. A successful collaboration between the IMF and UN Women. The course was attended by 45 participants from sub-Saharan Africa, half of which were women. I am glad, really glad, that men and women showed up in equal numbers, because without the support of men, we cannot take this agenda forward. And I am grateful to Dr. Maxime for participating with me on this floor in delivering our main remarks. This course focused on identifying gender gaps, estimating their macroeconomic impact, and choosing wisely the policy instruments to address them. While we touched upon gender-based violence in the course, the evidence on this is so striking and the issue so important that we decided to open up the discussion to a wider audience. Let me help set the stage for today's discussion. The pandemic has created havoc around the world, we know, bringing unimaginable uncertainties and anxieties. We will feel the physical and mental health consequences of this pandemic for years to come. On the economic side, even though economic growth in sub-Saharan Africa for this year is projected at 4%, this is far from the potential, and it represents the slowest recovery relative to other regions. Measures taken to mitigate the spread of the virus, such as national lockdown, social distancing, school closures, have reduced economic opportunities and increased unpaid work demands. The region also faces a slower pace of vaccine rollout, rising debt, more limited fiscal space, and regional disparities in resilience. Against this backdrop, the negative impact on women and girls across several dimensions have been disproportionate. The shadow pandemic of gender-based violence has risen exponentially. For instance, analysis by UKAID on Nigeria shows that during the first 2 weeks of the lockdown in March 2020, there was a 56% increase in reported gender-based violence. Meanwhile, in India, the National Commission for Women reported an increase of 250% in domestic violence cases. These are stomach-churning numbers. Coming from India, I feel it even more. Gender-based violence leaves long-term scars on its victims and their families. In addition, we now have evidence that gender-based violence can hold back whole societies from developing properly. As you will see clearly in the analysis brought out today, gender-based violence also causes short-term macroeconomic losses, leading to a loss in the numbers of hours victims work, has implications for children's development, as well as impacts overall productivity while at work. And in the longer run, gender-based violence can reduce female labor force participation and more generally human capital development. Eliminating gender-based violence should be high on everyone's agenda. For all these reasons, IMF staff are joining forces with UN Women, country authorities, and other partners to address this issue. We should collectively advocate zero tolerance for such violence. During today's discussion, our speakers from UN Women and the IMF will delve deeper into the evidence on the various fronts of the impacts of gender-based and sexual violence. We will also have a chance to look at policies and programs that have been successfully deployed to address those issues, including a specific focus on best practices by our colleagues from Rwanda. We all have a role to play, as Dr. Maxime said, in ensuring that gender-based and sexual violence is eliminated and that women and girls can thrive in a safe, healthy environment. We must proactively work together towards this common goal. Thank you.
Thank you, Ratna, and thank you, Maxime, for those opening remarks. The statistics and trends that you have presented paint a very sobering picture and clearly emphasize that there is much work to be done on eradicating all forms of gender-based violence, and why we all must redouble our efforts to tackle this challenge. So with that, let's now turn to our three panelists who will provide further evidence on the depth of gender-based violence and the macroeconomic costs and impacts. The three will offer policy interventions and solutions aimed at eradicating gender-based violence. So let me introduce our first panelist. Ms. Sunita Kamina is the Regional Policy Specialist for Ending Violence Against Women for the UN Women's East and Southern Africa region. With 15 years of experience in gender equality and ending violence against women and girls programming. She joined UNIFEM in 2008, working first in New York City, and then with UN Women in Timor-Leste as the head of office, with prior roles overseeing the Women, Peace and Security, and Ending Violence Against Women portfolios. She has worked with civil society on conflict-sensitive development and early warning, and holds a Master of International Affairs from Columbia University. Our second panelist is Rasmane Ouedraogo, and he is the IMF resident representative in Niger. In his previous assignments, he has worked on Côte d'Ivoire, Central African Republic, and in the IMF Statistics Department. Prior to joining the IMF, Rasmane was at the World Bank's Macroeconomics and Fiscal Management Global Practice. Mr. Ouedraogo received his PhD in economics from the University of Auvergne, Clermont-Ferrand. He holds master's degrees in international economics, development economics, and project management from the Clermont School of Economics, and a bachelor's degree in macroeconomics and development management from the University of Ouagadougou. Our third panelist is Mireille Batamuliza, who is a social activist with 10 years experience in managing projects in health, education, and social development for the most vulnerable groups, including women, adolescent girls, children, and those affected by sociocultural problems. She actively participates in community activities, mainly in the areas of family promotion, prevention, and the response of gender-based violence, and women and children's rights promotion and protection. Mireille holds a master's degree in social work, a bachelor's degree in social sciences, and a diploma in nursing, which she credits with making social problems more understandable for her. Before I turn over the virtual microphone to Sunita, just a reminder for the Q&A session. We ask that you use the chat feature to ask all of your questions, and please include your name, your affiliation, and your country in the question. We will be monitoring the chat throughout the presentations, and then after Mireille's presentation ends, we'll begin our Q&A session. And so with that, Sunita, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon to you all. It's great to see so many participants and active interest in this session. Just share my screen. So just 1 minute. As this is coming up. Great. I hope that is visible to everyone and audible as well. So first, really, again, I appreciate the opportunity to provide this background on the evidence on gender-based violence across the continent of Africa. And as we start, I would like to acknowledge that, as we've heard in the opening remarks, the gender-based violence really affects every single person, either directly or indirectly. And As we discuss this subject, over the course of the afternoon, I hope that we can also remind ourselves that while it is really troubling how so many of us are affected by this single human rights violation, the fact that we have these so many connections to the issue of gender-based violence means that we actually, each of us can make a difference and lessen the burden for future generations and their society. So with that, I'd like to invite you to just sharing one snapshot of the different forms of violence and some of the data that exists and highlights just how widespread gender-based violence is. And I'd like to invite you to look at these figures, read the data that is being presented, and ask yourself, what is the takeaway message when you look at these figures on the slide? We can see just how many forms of violence continue to coexist in our society. And I'll note that not all forms of gender-based violence are listed. There's not enough space on the slide to show that. And it is visible that women and girls remain the overwhelming targets of gender-based violence. And that's not to say that men and boys don't experience violence. But when we look at the term gender-based violence, it's violence directed at a person because of their gender and their role, expectations of their gender role within society or their communities. And it highlights that the relationship between the expectation of women or females to be subordinate and their subordinate status in society vis-a-vis men creates that risk and increased vulnerability to violence. But we do see that, of course, men and boys can be victims of violence, and especially sexual violence. We can also see, and as Dr. Maxime had pointed out, that there's a high level of numbers of women who experience violence by their partner, even losing their own lives. And that's very troubling. We can see the violence starts at a very early age and it has no age limit. And that even when women are in positions of leadership, they continue to remain targets of gender-based abuses. So where do we go from here? At this point, I'd like to invite you, and I'd like to propose that we start with ourselves and also really keep attention to hearing what survivors of violence are saying. And while the numbers can seem overwhelming, gender-based violence is perpetrated by individuals on other individuals and is continued because some individuals allow it to. And we must locate each of ourselves in these spaces as we are all involved. And as a message from Jahad Jukure, UN Women's Good Ambassador to End Female Genital Mutilation, reminds us, by allowing child marriage to continue, we are allowing sexual assault of girls to continue. It's a very stark and I think it highlights the really challenging nature of this issue that we all must confront. And I'll now like to show a short video from a women's and youth rights advocate in Zambia who's sharing her story and also reminds us of ways that we can act in the struggle to end gender-based violence. Change the screen for a minute.
My name is Wamweni Samundengu. I am from Lusaka, Zambia. I'm a women's activist. I advocate to end harmful practices against women and girls and to end child marriage. I was a child bride myself. I was married at the age of 17 in a foreign country in a very traditional and religious setting. I didn't have the liberty of asking questions or challenging what was happening to me. And so I am very passionate about creating safe spaces for women and girls to be able to open up about their situations, open up about their experiences in a safe space without any judgment. I am part of a peer-to-peer savings and investment group that helps women who have been in similar situations with financial resources. In addition to that, I am the author of a blog post titled By the Words of Her Testimony, where young women and girls are able to open up about their experiences. My call to action would be to families and communities to be in the forefront and to play an active role in challenging religious, traditional, and cultural norms that pose a risk to the lives of young women and girls. It takes a village to raise a child, and so I urge communities and families to be in the forefront, to ask questions and pay attention to what is happening in the lives of the people around you, particularly the lives of young women and girls.
So I hope you found that an opportunity and a hopeful message from us, around what we can all do and the actions we can all take. Because again, that's how we will make change, is when we all can engage in this issue and from our different spaces and the platform. So moving a little bit deeper into the issue. To address the economic costs of gender-based violence, we really need to understand the issue to its full extent and the full scope. When we look at the different forms of gender-based violence, we can see that they manifest in 4 general ways: the physical, sexual, economic, and psychological. And it's really important to understand these nuances, because often, and this is why the first 2 circles are highlighted in a different color, we often only focus on the physical or sexual violence. And when you think about the news headlines on gender-based violence, how often do we see reports around economic or financial abuse? How many of our costing studies actually look at psychological forms of abuse? So it's really important that, considering the different manifestations of violence against women, it will help us ensure that the responses are comprehensive and really reach the scope of those who are affected. We also need to understand, continuing this understanding of the scope, the different forms of GBV. And some of these were already shared in the first slide. As we've seen and we've heard already, intimate partner violence is the most prevalent form of violence. And it's really challenging because this is violence that happens at homes, in areas with relationships that are supposed to be trusted. We know that there's also non-partner sexual violence, which includes harassment and forms of abuse that do not always involve physical contact. Conflict-related sexual violence, femicide, or the murder of women because of their gender, harmful practices, child marriage, female genital mutilation, in some communities, violence committed in the name of so-called honor. So there's so many forms that we have to acknowledge and count when we're thinking about responses and thinking about holistic approaches. We also need to recognize the many different places that gender-based violence takes place, and that until now, there is really no safe space for women and girls to be able to enjoy their right to live free of violence. We also know that age, abilities, HIV status, sexual orientation, education, experiences of conflict, displacement, all of these are factors that increase a person's risk of experiencing gender-based violence. I think it's important to acknowledge that it's the context and the risks that they face, and not their inherent vulnerability as individuals. It's the situation that makes them vulnerable. Now, when we're thinking about what data that exists, we can see that we are making small steps to collect more data around gender-based violence, but there are still many gaps to be filled. The map here shows data on intimate partner violence, again, as I said, the most prevalent form of gender-based violence. And what we see is the estimates of prevalence, or the percentage of women in the population above the age of 15 that have experienced violence in the last 12 months from an intimate partner. And what we see is that in sub-Saharan Africa, across the region, you have 20% in that of the average of past year experiences, which is much higher than the world average of 13%. We also see that the lifetime experiences of non-partner sexual violence in the continent is 6%, but we know that many women do not report their experience of violence due to different barriers, and that actual experiences will always be higher than the data, even when we have dedicated surveys. Furthermore, it's really important to recognize that when we're looking at subgroups within the population or subnational data, the data would not look the same as the aggregate level, but that level of data is not always available. And all of this is pre-COVID data. And as we heard from the opening remarks, we know the intensification of violence that has happened. Highlighting here just some of the elements that we identified through some of the studies that have been done and through some of the data that is emerging from the experiences, women and girls' experiences during COVID. What that's meant is that that there has been this intensification of intimate partner violence that has taken place in the homes, and not all women and girls are safe. Homes are not always safe places, which is a real challenge when we have restrictions in movements. We also know that there's increased risk of violence due to school closures, the loss of income, the loss of peer support, which can facilitate and create channels for child marriage, sexual exploitation and abuse, adolescent pregnancy, which we've seen reported in many countries across the continent and the world. We also know that education delays critical progress, which increase the burdens of unpaid care work, harassment when we're looking at cross-border workers, access to services, and the lack of PPE for service providers. And secondary education in particular is a protective factor against gender-based violence. So when you have this loss of education, it adds a double burden as well. There's also been limitations in referral services with the movement restrictions, and we see that there has been a reduction in delivery of justice services, which again, not only from a criminal perspective in terms of processing of criminal cases, but also makes women and girls more economically vulnerable, because a lot of the protections that are available in the formal economy and workforce are not available in the informal sectors. And we also know that the use of technology alternatives are not an option for all. And because of already the digital gender gap, this has been, again, it has been intensified with COVID and creating greater forms of marginalization. Final point around data that I'd like to highlight is that there are data gaps around specific forms of violence. And so on the left, you can see the increase in the number of countries that have dedicated population-based surveys on intimate partner violence, which is fantastic. It's a fantastic increase. But what we can also see on the right is that for forms of violence such as sexual harassment, conflict-related sexual violence, technology-facilitated violence, femicide, sexual exploitation, there are much fewer data sources and investments in these studies. So the takeaway here is that when we're looking at data, it's important to consider, but it's important to recognize that this is just one element, and it shouldn't be the only element that informs our policy decisions. So, and these gaps really shouldn't stop us from acting on what we know around gender-based violence, because the evidence is abundant and it's clear. There has been significant progress in actually growing this evidence base based on what works to end gender-based violence. And in the 30 years since the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Declaration on Ending Violence Against Women. So the starting point is that it's important to understand how the wider structural environment can enable violence to take place. And research shows us that it's the systematic gender inequality, which exists in most societies across the world, and is a really powerful driver of men's use of violence against women. In most societies, what we see, and as we heard earlier, and we know from the data, and I think from the course, the data you've seen, men have greater access to power and resources than women. And these are the gender inequalities that are created and reinforced at different levels of society, from the discriminatory social norms, practices, and structures that are manifested at individual, interpersonal, and families, communities, and institutions. And this is what the slide shows, is how that power imbalance really permeates all levels of society. And we can see how at the societal level, policies often legitimate or reinforce gender inequalities. For example, laws related to land or property ownership, inheritance, access to credit, marriage and divorce, community development levels. We can see that norms and practices also reinforce gender inequality. For example, what are the expectations about jobs men and women should do? Who can speak? Who can be consulted, for example, when there are policy decisions to be made around taxation? At the interpersonal and relationship level, the institutions of marriage and the family, ideas around privacy, honor, also affect how men and women are treated and how practices take place. And at the individual level, women and men are often influenced and may subscribe to these beliefs because of their expected roles and behaviors in society. So we really can see how these gender inequalities are embedded and reinforced in formal, informal institutions, structures, and the norms at all levels of society. And I'll be coming back to this multi-layered image and visual throughout in terms of not only understanding the issue, but understanding the solutions. So here's one example of that. When we go even deeper, and with a focus on intimate partner violence, because again, the data and the investment in this issue as the most prevalent form of gender-based violence has been greater than other forms. We now have more evidence of how gender inequality, again, interacts across different levels of society to increase a person's risk. So these are risk factors, most often, again, women and girls, that as well as the factors affecting men's perpetration or the likelihood of them perpetrating violence against women. So for example, at the societal level, risks include discriminatory policies, low levels of women's employment and education, weak enforcement of laws, and discrimination within institutions across sectors. And it's also important to note that women's economic empowerment in some contexts can be a protective factor, and in other contexts, it can be a trigger for violence. And this is why gender-based violence must look at, addressing gender-based violence must look at the underlying gender norms and power imbalances as part of any response. And initiatives that only look at one element or one aspect of empowerment will not be as effective and can actually do more harm. So I will not go into all of these points, but again, the takeaway message from this slide is that there are many factors that can increase risk of experiencing violence. And all of these factors also create entry points for shaping policy and programmatic interventions that can help to counter the risks and create protective factors. Now, in terms of the consequences and costs of gender-based violence, and I know there'll be a specific presentation on the costs right after, so I won't go into depth. What's important to note is that the costs of violence and the consequences are widespread, and they cut across every level, from the individual, family, community, and societal level. Not all are tangible, and it's important that some are indirect, and some are direct, and some are tangible, and some are intangible. All individuals within society, both perpetrators and survivors, are carrying those costs. But of course, the consequences of violence is mostly carried by survivors themselves, the women and girls who experience gender-based violence. And we know that there are physical consequences, psychological health consequences, social, financial consequences on the individual, but that there's also consequences for families of the individuals who experience gender-based violence. For example, for children in terms of well-being, in terms of income, in terms of other factors. And the costs of violence to communities are high, as we again heard in the beginning. We also have to consider the future costs, because there is a strong link between violence against children and children witnessing abuse and violence as adults, and which again has gendered factors to it, and that needs to be recognized. Where do we go from here? And this is a picture of Equiterra when we'd like to imagine a future without violence, and when we've achieved gender equality. So I'd like to now move into the solutions around what we might expect and how we might access these spaces, access these solutions. So I'm showing this slide, which is some of the evidence, is highlighting some of the evidence that's coming out. Because we now know what we need in efforts to address violence against women and girls. And there are 6 areas of interventions that we need to be investing in and putting focus. And I'm using the example from the Spotlight Initiative, which is a global initiative with the United Nations and European Union that was launched in 2017 as the single largest global investment in ending violence against women and girls, dedicated to accelerating progress on SDG 5 on gender equality. It was designed to bring results. It was designed building on evidence of what works. And the approach also highlights some of the considerations that we need to be taking into consideration if we're looking at addressing the economic costs of gender-based violence. First, initiatives need to be holistic. There needs to be a foundation that recognizes the equal rights of women and girls as the starting point. It needs to consider how violence can occur at any point in a person's lifetime, and also taking care to really address groups of women and girls who are most often left behind and facing multiple forms of discrimination. It is also structured in a way that works through partnerships and across the different levels of society, because there is a critical role for building relationships and having community ownership. Change, again, has to start from within, and there's not a single institution, sector, or organization that can bring change alone. So I'll now go through a snapshot briefly of how where we are on some of these different spaces. In terms of normative frameworks and legislation across the continent, what we see is that we have a strong foundation. uphold women and girls' right to live free of violence. That exists. We have a lot of constitutional provisions. We have ratification of key human rights conventions, such as the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Convention on the Elimination of all Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW, Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Regionally, we have many countries that have signed on to the Maputo Protocol, as well as we have the African Union Gender Strategy. There's also commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals, Beijing Platform for Action. There's no shortage of commitments. But what we also know is that while laws and policies are a starting point, and it's important to support awareness raising of women's and girls' right to live free of violence, it's not enough alone. Many countries, we also have plural legal system, and in that we see that there are some contradictory terms and situations where what's in the formal legal system does not always connect with what's in the customary law, religious law. And we also see that implementation and effectiveness really varies by country. Monitoring remains a challenge. In terms of policies and institutions, what we see is that some countries have dedicated national action and strategies on gender-based violence. And there are also developments underway for a regional action plan across the continent. We also see that there is a recurrent under-resourcing of the policies that have been developed. And this is where investments in costing and gender-responsive budgeting are really critical to move all these commitments and all these foundations into action. It's also an opportunity to ensure that public finance management efforts, institutional performance metrics include attention and the issues of gender-based violence, because we'll have a much stronger chance at reaching our targets and also improving the overall governance structure when these are in place. In terms of preventing violence before it begins, there are 7 areas of intervention that are needed to drive primary prevention, which is preventing it before it begins, which cut across, again, the 7 different levels I shared earlier. The set of approaches has been captured into a framework called the Respect Women Framework, which was developed by the World Health Organization together with UN Women and has been endorsed by various parts of the UN. Interventions support relationship skills strengthening, the empowerment of women, again, not only looking at the economic empowerment, but the social empowerment and transforming gender norms. Making sure services for survivors are in place. And it's fantastic that we have our speaker from the Isange Center and speaking about Rwanda's experience as a good model, addressing poverty, making sure that environments, physical infrastructure is made safe, ensuring that child and adolescent abuse is prevented, again, because there is this strong link between violence against women and violence against children, and transforming attitudes, beliefs, and norms. The takeaway message from this slide is that there are these different levels of interventions that are needed. It's not about doing one or over another. Actually, all are needed to have successful prevention efforts. And it's also critical that we can see that there are various initiatives on the continent itself using these models. And so we have a lot of good practices that can be taken to scale as we move forward. In terms of services, there's also been an increasing attention and recognition and clarity on what is really needed in terms of comprehensive services to help survivors respond and moving forward from their experiences. That is captured in a package called the Essential Services Package for Survivors of Violence, developed by the UN system as well, and carried out and implemented across many countries, including on the continent. Critical needs include health, social services, justice, policing, as well as coordination, and in terms of implementation, costing and monitoring of these. So again, it's worth, it's the costing and resourcing of these investments is really critical if we're going to move forward. It's also worth mentioning that despite, again, the acknowledgement of the services that are needed, we still see many gaps in terms of accessibility, in terms of the quality of these services, in terms of who can actually access, again, looking at the barriers that different women and girls face. And just a note in terms of, again, when we're looking at counting metrics of what is in place and solutions, it's important not only to look at the infrastructure that's in place or the services that exist, but usage and trust by survivors themselves. And this is just a snapshot from a study UN Women did across 10 countries in the region that highlights the levels of trust in different types of justice institutions. So you can see that, while the religious institutions had the highest, courts didn't have as much, where is often, where the investments are made. And it's important to recognize that as we're looking to create more options and supports for survivors. Final area, which is really critical, I'd like to mention, is around strengthening women's rights organizations, feminist movements, and civil society, because we know that through decades of work and contributions, these organizations have really been at the forefront for why the issue has taken such a high space on the agenda today, advocating for prevention, the policy changes, as well as services. We also know that strong civil society and women's movements are protective factors. Is actually evidence that they serve as protective factors at a societal level against violence against women and girls. And we also know that to be effective, funding needs to be ethical, feminist, and sustain the autonomy of diverse women's organizations and movements. And that's where partnerships and conversations with these organizations is really critical as part of the process of shaping solutions. I'll finally just end highlighting this a snapshot that, with initiatives like Spotlight, the reach is quite wide. And again, because the focus is around partnership and it's a dedicated investment, it has the potential to bring significant results. And here's just a snapshot of some of the results that have been captured in the first couple of years of the initiative. It's still ongoing. And again, the reminder here is that as we're crafting solutions, it's really important to keep that comprehensive view and not just focus on one element of the solution, but really support comprehensive response will be more sustainable in the end. And I'll end on the point that as the Generation Equality Forum, which was held last year in Paris and Mexico City, came up with different action coalitions to help accelerate progress in different areas of gender equality, one being gender-based violence. And it brings together different actors, government, development partners, civil society, and that's a space for all of us who are part of this conversation today can really engage and drive forces to contribute and accelerate progress. So with that, and there are different commitments that have already been made in the country, across the continent, in different countries, as part of this coalition, and there are more information is available at the bottom of the slide that you can access if you want to learn more. And a few more resources I've added to share in case you are interested to continue to learn more and take action on the issue. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Sunita, for your excellent presentation. You presented a wealth of evidence, and I think the vision of Equiterra that you shared can help frame our work as we continue to think about solutions to the costs and consequences of gender-based violence. So with that, let me turn over to Rasmane now. So Rasmane, the microphone is yours.
Hello, Lisa. Do you see my screen?
Yes, we do, Rasmane, you are good.
Okay, thank you so much. And good afternoon or morning to all participants. Very glad to see you all connected. Thank you to Sunita for a great presentation. It makes a very good transition to our presentation about the economic consequences of gender-based violence. As you said, the consequences could be at the individual, family, or society level. And for our work, we are looking at the consequences at the macro level. The work was done with David Stenzel, who is an economist in the African department. Before continuing, let me turn off my video as my internet connection is very unstable. So the study is motivated by what we observed during this pandemic, the increase in domestic violence against women, with a poor economic and social conditions coupled with the lockdown measures. Intimate partner violence is reportedly increased in many countries. For example, according to one report by the International Group Center, the number of reported cases of gender-based violence increased from 300 in March to more than 700 in April 2020, following the introduction of lockdowns at the end of March in Nigeria. With the lockdown measures, many women are being forced to stay at home with their abusers, and even more sadly, they have very little possibility to ask for help. So in the study that we made, it is very empirical study. I will try to be less technical, but please let me know if you have any question. We look at how the increased level of gender-based violence affect the economy. There are several channels through which gender-based violence create an economic cost, including lower labor supply, reduced productivity per hour work, less investment in human capital for both women and their children. If we consider the long-term drivers of economic growth, gender-based violence affect all components. First, it reduces human capital accumulation by leading to poor health, lower labor supply, education and accumulation of skills for the victims and their children. Second, gender-based violence can reduce the physical capital accumulation by lowering public investment due to higher demand for health and judicial services. Public resources are diverted to investigation and to treat injured victims instead of being invested in the economy. Finally, previous studies have shown that victims of gender-based violence are less productive when they do work, and there are some reputational demands that could reduce total productivity of companies where abusers and victims are working for. What we do in this study, there are already some studies that have explored the impact of gender-based violence on the economy, and most studies are either based on country cases or they are using simple national accounting methods who don't address the problem of reverse causality. So in this study, we are taking an innovative approach. First, we are using large harmonized survey data and cover a sample of 18 sub-Saharan African countries. Second, we are able to address the problem of reverse causality by using instrumental variable approach. And third, as I described in the previous slide about several transmission channels, in this study, we are able to check one of them, which is the labor supply channel. Finally, we are investigating some nonlinear defect based on the adoption of protective laws against domestic violence, the education gap between partners, women decision-making power, and the economic conditions. Now let's go into detail about the study, starting with the data sources. The study is based on 29 integrated demographic and health surveys from the USAID program in 18 sub-Saharan African countries from the 80s to the present. The database includes nationally representative samples of country census that correspond typically to 10% of the population. Although the sample belong to different years, they are harmonized by the Minnesota Population Center for comparability of variables across countries and over time. The sample covers more than 440,000 women from 224 districts. The estimates are performed at the district level to gain variability and improve the statistical properties of the results. The table on the right presents the list of countries, census years, the number of districts, and individuals. As for the measurement of economic development at the district level, we use satellite data unlike time-like provided by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. The most commonly used measure for economic activity, GDP, is not available at the district level. However, some recent studies have shown that NIC-like satellite data is highly correlated with GDP, particularly in low-income countries such as African countries. Now, using this data, let's see the extent of gender-based violence in the world. The chart on the left presents the level of physical, sexual, and emotional violence against women by income group from the USAID Demographic and Health Survey Program. On average, more than 1/4 of women experienced intimate partner violence in recent years. The level of such violence is higher in low-income countries than in middle-income countries. In low-income countries, nearly 1/3 of women experience domestic violence. against around 1/5 of women in upper middle-income countries. On the right, we have the level of gender-based violence by region. We observe that there are some differences across regions in the world. The sub-Saharan African region has the highest rate of domestic violence, with more than 30% of women who had experienced intimate partner violence, followed by the East Asia and Pacific region. The next slide presents the prevalence of domestic violence against women for each country. We see that there are some variation between countries. In Afghanistan, Papua New Guinea, Liberia, and DRC, nearly half of women experienced physical, sexual, and emotional violence committed by a husband or partner. In the top 10 countries with the highest rate of domestic violence, there are 7 countries from the sub-Saharan African region. We also look at, in terms of form of violence in sub-Saharan Africa. In the data set, we have 7 forms of violence, including physical result of husband actions, punching with fist or something harmful, slapping, pushing, shaking, or throwing something, threatening with harm, experiencing emotional violence, and experiencing any sexual violence from partner. This table shows the percentage of ever partnered women who reported ever experienced any physical, emotional, or sexual violence by their current husband or partner. We can observe that there is huge variation depending on the form of violence. The table also shows that slapping is very frequent, with more than 1/3 of women reporting being slapped by a husband or partner in Gabon, DRC, Sierra Leone, and Zambia. Emotional violence is also common, with more than 40% of women reporting ever experienced emotional violence in Gabon, Senegal, and Uganda. In these 2 charts, we present the relationship between violence against women and like per capita, which is our proxy for economic activity at the district level. On the left, we use a composite index of violence against women, which is the simple average of the 7 forms of violence presented in the previous slide. And on the right, we use any physical result of husband action as indicator for violence against women. The 2 charts show a negative relationship between violence against women and like per capita, suggesting that higher the level of gender-based violence, lower the level of economic activities. However, let me clarify that these are just correlation and have no causal implication. We also present a relationship between gender-based violence and female employment, which is the transmission channel that we are able to check in the study. We see that there is a negative relationship between violence against women and female employment, meaning that the level of female employment tend to be low district with higher level of violence against women. Now let's move to the empirical part of the study. Equation 1 is the one that we estimated. On the left, we have like per capita growth, which is used as a proxy for economic activity at the subnational level. On the right, we have violence against women and a number of over-control variables, including the share of the agriculture sector to take on board the importance of the sector in Africa. We also control for some proxies for infrastructure, including the time to reach water sources and the total length of roads. We have included education to capture the role of human capital, and finally we include conflict in the index for religious fractionalization, given the high occurrence of conflict and religious tension in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, estimating the impact of gender-based violence on economic growth, we face 3 problems. The first one is measurement error. Measuring the prevalence of intimate partner violence through surveys could be inaccurate as generally victims of domestic violence tend to underreport either because of fear of retaliation, privacy concern, or other societal factors. Second, we have a problem of reverse causality, which is the common error of mistaking cause for effect and vice versa. In this study, we are looking at the impact of violence against women on the economic growth. However, a sharp economic downturn, including the experience of job loss and material hardship, could increase abusive behavior. Men who might otherwise have kept negative behavior in check may buckle under the stress of challenging economic circumstances and engage in abusive behavior. Therefore, the direction of the effect is not clear. Third, we have the unobservable factors. There are several other factors that affect the level of economic activities that we are unable to observe and include in the estimate, for example, the cultural and social norms. So to address these three problems, we are using an instrumental variable approach in which we instrument the level of violence against women in a given district with a level of violence in the neighboring district. And the intuition is that regional cultural closeness and communities could lead neighboring districts to share some common values and behaviors. It is natural that being physically close to each other facilitate communication, social interaction, diffusion of cultural values, and learning across different societies. And therefore, people may tend to share some common behaviors such as the acceptance of domestic violence. With this instrument based on the level of domestic violence in neighboring district, we run the estimate using two-stage list scale method. This chart presents the result of the estimate. We are showing the estimated coefficient associated with our variable of interest, which is violence against women. The bar represents the size of the impact, and the stars are the level of significance of the coefficient. We find that the estimated coefficients are all negative and strongly significant regardless of the form of violence. Therefore, intimate partner violence against women reduce economic activity in sub-Saharan Africa. Based on the first bar on the left, where we use the average index, an increase of domestic violence against women by 1 percentage point could reduce like per capita by 8.7% over the long run. The result also saw that the size of the impact depends on the form of violence, with threatening with harm, punishing with something harmful, and emotional violence having the biggest impact. We also check whether female employment is a transmission channel. We estimate the impact of violence against women on the level of female employment at the district level using the same instrumental variable approach. This chart presents the result. Again, the bar represents the size of the impact of violence against women and female employment. And we find that the impact is negative for all forms of violence. In other words, female employment is lower in districts with higher level of violence against women. Similarly to the estimate on economic activities, threatening with harm, punishing with something harmful, and emotional violence have the biggest impact on the female employment. Finally, we investigate some non-linearity effect. We explore the role of a law governing domestic violence in the country the endowment in natural resources, the business cycle or economic conditions in the country, and women decision-making power, and the education gap between partners. Let's start with law on domestic violence. The presence of protective laws against domestic violence have proven to be effective in dealing with physical, psychological, and emotional abuse. Laws can not only be beneficial to women seeking to address domestic violence in their relationship, but can also help enhance their physical and psychological well-being. Some countries are also adopting protective provisions to ensure that women labor force participation is not affected by domestic violence. In this regard, we suspect that the economic impact of domestic violence will depend on whether or not there are some laws against domestic violence in the country. To check this assumption, we include an interactive variable between protective laws against domestic violence and gender-based violence in the estimator. The results are in the first column. We find that the coefficient associated with violence against women still remain negative and significant, while the coefficient associated with the interaction variable between law and violence against women is positive and significant. This finding implied that the negative effect of gender-based violence on Nile life per capita is dampened in countries with legal provisions against domestic violence. Legal provisions can not only help reduce the occurrence of domestic violence by deterring abusive behavior, but they also guarantee women access to justice for violence-related cases, which could enhance their well-being and boost their economic participation. Second, we test whether the economic impact of domestic violence depend on the endowment in natural resources. Some studies have provided evidence that mining zones can be a very hostile climate for women in general, as women tend to benefit less from mining activities. Other studies have shown that natural resources can increase women's risk of being abused by their intimate partners. In such environment where women dependency is high, domestic violence could be elevated, which could lead to a high adverse economic impact. We included in column 2 an interaction variable between violence against women and a binary variable taking the value of 1 if there is a mining set in the district and 0 otherwise. We find that the coefficient associated with violence against women and the interaction variable are negative and significant, suggesting that the economic cost of domestic violence are higher in a resource-rich district than in non-resource-rich district. The loss of female economic power and the higher dependency of women on their partners in the resource-rich district make women more vulnerable, increasing the risk of domestic violence and the related economic cost. Third, during the COVID-19 pandemic crisis, we have observed an increase in domestic violence around the world. This is not unprecedented, as previous studies have underscored that the Great Depression was also followed by a proliferation of intimate partner violence. We believe that this increase of domestic violence during economic downturn may exacerbate the economic cost of domestic violence compared to normal times and further delay the economic recovery. To explore this assumption, we constructed a commodity price index at the district level using the data on the main commodity of each district, including gold, maize, rice, soybean, sugarcane, wheat, sunflower, groundnut, and oil palm. We then used the price data from the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development dataset to construct the commodity price index, which is considered as an external factor as prices are determined at the international level. Given the reliance of sub-Saharan African economies and commodities, the change in economic condition is mostly driven by the fluctuation in commodity prices. So we included the interaction variable between the commodity price index and gender-based violence in column 3. The results show that the coefficient associated with violence against women remain negative and strongly significant, while the coefficient associated with the interaction variables is positive and significant. And this finding suggests that the economic cost of domestic violence are higher during bad time like the current one. And it also implied that the increase in domestic violence during this pandemic associated with the poor economic conditions could have more detrimental effect on economic recovery in sub-Saharan Africa. Finally, we explore the role of women decision-making power in column 4 and the gender gap in education in column 5. Many researchers have described intimate partner violence as a result of unbalanced power and control, and women with limited decision-making power were found to be subject to more physical violence. In fact, higher decision-making power could increase women's ability to escape domestic violence, scare away violent partners, or at least lessen its intensity. To measure the level of decision-making power, we rely on some of the survey questions about women's ability to take decisions about their health care without the husband's prior approval. And we then constructed an indicator measuring the percentage of women who are able to take their own decisions regarding healthcare needs. The results are in column 4, and so that the interaction variable between women's decision-making power and violence against women is positive and strongly significant. And this finding suggests that the economic impact of violence against women is lower in districts where women have higher level of decision-making power. Regarding education, it has been shown as protective against abuse. High educational attainment is negatively associated with being both a victim and a perpetrator of abuse. We measure the education gap as the difference in education level between husband and wives. The results from the estimate are in the last column, column 5, and we find that the coefficient associated with the interaction variable between violence against women and education gap is negative and significant, meaning that districts with higher level of gender gap in education tend to suffer most from domestic violence. We also conducted a number of robustness checks. First, we used some variable related to women's attitude toward intimate partner violence. We rely on some questions in the survey data set asking women whether a husband is justified in beating his wife in various hypothetical situations, including for any reason, arguing with a husband, women burn food, women goes out without telling him, women refuse to have sex, and women neglect the children. Some studies have shown that women's attitude toward domestic violence are shaped by their own experience of domestic violence or social norms inherited from the local communities. And there are some studies that have used attitude toward intimate partner violence as a proxy for domestic violence. So using this proxy, our result didn't change. We also use different alternative, different instrumental variable. This is the median of domestic violence in the neighboring district, and the result remained consistent. Third, we excluded the outliers, which are the top 5% and the bottom 5% of observation, and the exclusion of outliers didn't change the result. Finally, we included some more covariate, including population density, precipitation, the wealth index, the income gap between partners, a binary variable whether there is oil field in the district or not, the percentage of women who have access to bank, and the percentage of women who have access to electricity. And the inclusion of all of these covariate in the estimate didn't change the result. We can conclude that the result remained broadly robust. To conclude, let me recall our main finding, which is that gender-based violence is a threat to economic development. And based on the finding of the study, there are several policies that countries in sub-Saharan Africa can adopt to reduce domestic violence and its economic cost. First, the findings imply that adopting and reinforcing laws against domestic violence and strengthening women's decision-making power could help lower the economic cost of domestic violence. Strong laws are crucial to deter violence against women, protect victims of domestic violence, and promote women participation in the labor market. Second, the result highlights that countries should encourage girls' education in order to reduce the gender gap in education and attenuate the influence and control by men. Finally, countries should pay attention to the increased level of domestic violence during the COVID-19 pandemic. As we find in the study, the economic cost of violence against women is higher during downturn, like this pandemic, implying that the economic recovery from the current crisis could take longer if domestic violence is not addressed as part of their economic recovery plans. Okay, let me stop here. Thank you very much for your attention. Lisa, the floor.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Rasmane. I was just unmuting there. Thank you. So as an economist, I find your and David's work fascinating. In this paper develops empirical evidence and quantifies the macroeconomic costs of gender-based violence. And this can provide a bridge for discussing this issue with policymakers. Now, if we know some of the potential drivers, as well as the macroeconomic losses, this can help inform better policy decisions and could help support the development of targeted programs for gender-based violence, which I think leads us nicely into our final presentation of the day. So let me now turn to Mireille, who will offer her experience and expertise on Rwanda's efforts to address gender-based violence. Mireille, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm trying to share my screen. Oh, sorry, I can't see if you can see it.
Not quite.
Is there anyone that can help?
Let me check with ATI, and we'll get this presentation sorted out quickly. Thank you for your patience.
I will share it for Mireille. Yeah, let me share it for her.
I'm using a MacBook gadget. Sometimes it's quite difficult to connect to Zoom or other platforms.
Is that okay, Mireille? I'm sharing the PDF one because the PowerPoint one is not opening.
Okay.
Is that fine with you?
Yes, I think it's okay.
Or do you wish me to try again for the PowerPoint version?
That's fine. We can go with it.
Okay.
Yes. I really thank my colleagues Sunita and Rosman for setting the tone to this discussion. For the first, go to the first, to the next. Okay. The previous one, please.
This one, please?
No, the next one, the following.
The following. Next.
Then the previous to this one.
This one.
There is no one previous to this? Because we are at 5th page. Go to the 2nd page. Yes.
Okay. There's some difficulty.
Okay, this one.
2nd page, yes.
Yeah. I want to quote His Excellency, the President of Rwanda, the he for she world champion, launching the judicial year in 2021, last year, where he highlighted that everyone's role to end GBV, but also commit on the government side and institution, mainly the legal frameworks towards punishing the perpetrators. He said, we should put all our efforts into fighting these crimes and ensure that it reduces significantly. The authors of this crime, their accomplices, and those that protect them should face thought punishment. And this also highlights what Sunita says, highlighting that fighting the GBV is everyone's role. Everyone has a role in this matter, in GBV matters. The next, please. Yes, you know, Rwanda, after the genocide against the Tutsi, Rwanda was really devastated at all levels, at economic, political, and social levels. Also, some might heard that sexual abuse was used as a genocide weapon, which aggravated the situation of women in Rwanda. We have since committed to gender equality promotion and zero tolerance of any form of violence, including the GBV. From that time, a number of laws were amended, treaties, conventions, agreements were ratified and adopted. And despite all of this, women and girls, men and boys are still facing the gender-based violence. To give an overview of where we stand as Rwanda in terms of GBV, next please. The spousal violence among ever married women and men has increased and is still high among women compared to men, from over 40 to 46 in women, comparing the data from DHS 2015 and 2019. And also we found that the issue of women living in informal unions is still high, with 34% at national level, which makes them not protected, fully protected by the law, and affects negatively their rights, the enjoyments of their rights and those of their children. We have also a high number of defilement cases, which has the teen mothers as consequences. Though we had the teen pregnancy rate that decreased from 2014, 15 to 2019, 2020, from 7% to 5%, it's still quite high. Next, please. When it comes to Isange One-Stop Center model, first of all, the Isange is an innovative, homegrown solution to respond to GBV and child abuse victims. Isange means feel at home. It was established in 2009 by His Excellency, the First Lady, Mrs. Jeannette Kagame, to provide timely, affordable, comprehensive support and free services to victims through a multidisciplinary approach. The beneficiaries of these services include boys and girls, women and men that suffers from gender-based violence. The next slide is about the operational framework of Isange One-Stop Center and shows when the victim enters at Isange, the victim first of all meets with the receptionist, who is in most cases a social worker that explains the services that are available and tries to provide the first counseling to the victim, for the victim to calm down and to cool down, and for the medical team to support. And then there is an investigator that provides the judicial support. After that, the victim goes to the medical doctor that provides and assesses the needs of the victim. After that, the victim is received by a psychosocial specialist, a psychologist, or a counselor, but in many cases is a psychologist. And if the victim needs time to sit down and being treated on a regular basis, being followed, she's kept in the safe room there, and where the victim also is provided with the legal support in the same building. Also, for the exit purposes, the victim is linked with the community, because after being settled, after being treated in all ways, the victim is linked to the community, to the family, and the follow-up visits are conducted to prepare the family, the community, as well as the victim to go back to the community. Next, please. Yes, these are the services as I was explaining. The multidisciplinary services start at the reception, and they are provided 24/7 under one roof. And it's very important to highlight that is provided also free of charge. And the referral system from the health center, from other service providers to the Isange itself, also to the community when the victim is well treated and can be resent to the family. Next, please. Yeah, other services is that Isange has been scaled up to 495 health centers. And allow me first maybe to give a short background on the health system in Rwanda, where we have the Isange One-Stop Centers, one of the units in the hospitals. And the hospitals are set at district level. So we have 4 provinces plus the city of Kigali. And and under that we have 30 districts. At that level is where we do have the district hospitals. At now they are 44, and they all have Isange One-Stop Center units, among others. And under the districts, we have sectors. We have 416 sectors. And at that level, when it comes to health, we do have health centers. And there we have 495 health centers that are equipped with the staff and the trained staff to provide basic services, including counseling and prophylaxis against HIV incidences and also the pregnancy. And also after giving the basic services, they are able to refer the victim to the Isange for further services, specialized services. We have also the GBV, Gender-Based Violence Management Information System, that enhances data collection and allows all 44 Isange One-Stop Centers reporting together. As I mentioned earlier, we do have the 4 safe houses that are additional. They are different to the safe rooms that I mentioned, because the safe room is part of the Isange One-Stop Center services that are provided where the victim that needs like 2-3 days hospitalized, the close follow-up by the medical team, they will be set in the safe room. But if they need more time, they will be, sometimes it's not only having the medical services, but maybe the case under investigation, maybe the victim is not ready to go back to the community. So the victim is accommodated in the nearest safe house instead of being in the safe room, because the safe room is for the emergency and the close follow-up from the medical team. Next, please. We do have also, for the coordination purposes, we do conduct quarterly meetings with a Isange One-Stop Center multidisciplinary team at national and district level. Also a joint training of all service providers are being conducted every year to ensure they all work together and they complement each other. The Isange One-Stop Center, as I mentioned, is one of the units in the hospital, and for all of them, they are equipped and they are now fully incorporated in the district hospital structures. We have at least 8 rooms at each Isange, where we do have a specific room for the reception. We have adult therapy room, the children therapy room that are really child-friendly, and we have an investigation room, the legal officer consulting room, and also the 2 safe rooms, one for male victims and another one for female victims. The next one, we do understand that preventing and responding to gender-based violence is a shared responsibility. Next page, please. Yes, it's a shared responsibility, and not only one institution can't do much regarding the prevention and the response part. So the coordination and management of Isange involves different institutions. And here I only mentioned the government institutions, but we do have platforms that allows discussions between the national institutions, but also with our stakeholders. These institutions have meetings twice a year as steering committee members to plan together and discuss strategically ways to prevent and respond to GBV. And also we do have quarterly meetings with our stakeholders from development institutions and international and local NGOs to discuss challenges, lessons learned, and share the knowledge. We do have the Ministry of Gender and Family Promotion, where I work, to oversee overall coordination and implementation of the national anti-GBV policy, of course, including to put in place mechanisms to coordinate Isange activities at central level. We have the Ministry of Health as a co-chair of the steering committee. Of course, the ministry, the MIGEPROF is the chair. The Ministry of Health, of course, deals with coordination and implementation of providing health services to victims. We have the Ministry of Local Government that support community awareness raising on service provided by Isange, the socio-economic reintegration for the victim when they leave Isange and they need to be reintegrated again into their community, and also to inspect the quality of services provided by district hospitals to GBV and child abuse victims, because the district and district hospitals are managed by the district, and districts are managed by the Ministry of Local Government. So they have that mandate to see the services, the quality of services that the district and district hospitals are providing to the victims. For Ministry of Justice and National Prosecution Authority, they provide, of course, the legal assistance to GBV and child abuse victims through what we call in French, Maison d'accès à la justice. Their staff, there are now 4 at each district that has one that deals specifically with the gender-based violence issues. So the Ministry of Justice has to make sure that these 4 staff that are based at district level are supporting the community, especially the victims, to get free support to prosecute and to provide the legal support to the victim, but also to make sure perpetrators are followed up. We have the Rwanda Investigation Board, the RIB, that deals on a day-to-day coordination of the operationalization of Isange model, and they do prevention and investigation on all GBV and child abuse cases. We do have the Rwanda Forensic Laboratory that provides forensic evidences on demand, of course, because they work closely with the National Public Prosecution Authority and the Investigation Board, the Investigation Bureau, for their mandate to fill the case and ease the identification and conviction of criminals. We have the Gender Monitoring Office that comes in to monitor how the service is being provided to the victim, and being there to advise on how we can improve and how we can collaborate, work together to provide quality services to the victims. I have mentioned few, but also the two others that have a main role is Rwanda National Police, that has a role to protect victims and also ensure security in the community, and also the National Child Development Agency that is under the Ministry of Gender and Family Promotion that deals with the child protection and child development promotion. The next slide, please. As of now, we have recorded some success where I can mention, I mentioned already. Sorry, where I mentioned that the Isange, when it started in 2009, it was only in one hospital. But as of now, all hospitals are equipped, have specialized staff to provide the services of the comprehensive service of Isange One Stop Center in all 44 district hospitals. Also, as I mentioned earlier, all health centers, 495 health centers, have staff that are empowered to provide basic services to victims of GBV and child abuse, especially the basic counseling and the prophylactic services and the referral process. And as of now, we do have reached over 128,000 victims that are accessed the services. And as you will see in the table, the numbers increases every year. Sometimes people ask themselves if it is about the crime being multiplied but we have explanation. As we do have service, we do really combine with the mobilization event. We go down to the community to tell them that the GBV victims shouldn't be ashamed to go out, seek services, because it's their right. So once mobilized, of course, the numbers will be increased. So every year we will see an increase of services, of people that are accessed these services. For us, it's really good to see these numbers increasing, but on other side, it shows that we have to work also on the prevention part, because we know the prevention is really, when it comes to cost, it's cost efficient, and when it comes to the response part, we know there is part of the human being that you can't heal with the responses strategies that we have once the GBV and all forms of violence are concerned. So we do understand the importance of working on the prevention part, but also the numbers shows that at least we started in the first year, we received 426 victims, but it doesn't mean victims weren't there. It shows how people are now understanding their rights, and they are open to seek support when they face any form of violence. Next, please. We have said this is, I wanted to share these two pictures where we go down, because we know at district level it's not closer to everyone. So we do the mobile clinics to go down and provide comprehensive services of Isange down there. And we do have challenges when it comes to reporting and providing that comprehensive package of the service as we wished. So we still see the negative cultural norms that tolerates violence of women and children and boys and men, and people are afraid to report. We still see and we still think there are a lot of unreported cases. And also for those who report, we see the delays in reporting and also limited knowledge in evidence preservation that really makes the legal support very difficult. So if they delay and they came without evidences, the legal support, the legal part of supporting them will be, of course, limited. So to achieve all of this, I would share some of the enabling factors. One is having the political will, as I mentioned, His Excellency and the team. He's one of the he for she champion. So there is that commitment and there is that political will at highest level that support the initiatives of ending GBV and providing support to the victims. And also we do have the anti-GBV and child abuse legal and institution frameworks in place. The next page, please. Yeah, we do have the institution in place and legal framework in place that are contributing a lot to the service provision and also to the punishment of the perpetrators. And also we do have the anti-GBV responses and policies and programs, though they are still limited and have been affected by the COVID conditions, where the budget has been reduced at each program. Also the programs related to support GBV victims, though we acknowledge and we say at global level that numbers has been increased, but we saw from global level to countries level, we have seen the reduction of budget, of fundings, of programs that are supporting these victims. And also we have strategic partners. I was the main partners in this. Well, of course, we have the government of Rwanda, and Isange, when it started, it was funded with the 1 UN funding and also with the World Bank. We work closely with the other international and national NGOs and also other development partners in the country. So to conclude my presentation, allow me also to quote His Excellency, the President of Rwanda, saying that violence against women and girls is violation of rights. Next, please. And a threat to progress in Africa and around the world. Our starting point is that this kind of abuse is completely unacceptable. Women are our mothers, our daughters, our wives. What debate is there in treating them as decently as we have to? I thank you all, and I think this will inspire us in whatever we do to protect our women, our wives, our daughters and mothers, not only to the GBV, but also to other forms of violence that hinder their full potential and full development. Thank you. I submit.
Thank you so much, Mireille, for that outstanding presentation and your inspiring closing message. I mean, the work that the Isange Center is doing really sets the bar very high and provides a model for how countries can work to address the wide array of needs that victims of gender-based violence face. your presentation also further highlights how addressing gender-based violence will require solutions that are cross-cutting, involving a wide array of ministries, departments, and agencies, and considering local level inputs and involvement as well. So with that, let me now turn to the Q&A session. So I'd like to ask all the presenters to turn on their videos and rejoin us. We have received many excellent questions throughout the session this morning, and we will try to address as many as we can in the next half hour or so. Thank you all to the presenters too for staying right on time. You made my job easy and left plenty of time for Q&A, so thank you for that. So to start, let me take 3 questions from the chat, and I'll pose one to each panelist, and we'll try to get through again as many rounds of questions as we can. So let's turn to Sunita first with the first question. So we have received a comment from Mr. Amadou Boubacar, who is a senior economist in the Ministry of Oil in Niger. And so his comment was, given that women trust more religious institutions than others, I suggest that more attention be given to religious leaders to play a key role in addressing the issue of women and girls' sexual violence. For Rasmane, the question for you this round is, how can the IMF develop the capacity of countries to do similar studies to help inform policymaking in their own countries? And for Mireille, could you please touch on whether or not Rwanda has a specific law on the repression of gender-based violence?
Thanks so much, Lisa, for that, and also for the question. So, and I think it's really important for highlighting the importance of engaging faith-based actors in addressing the issue of sexual violence against women and girls. And indeed, they are powerful actors, as well as we know experiences involving religious actors and faith-based institutions is also very prevalent, as we heard in the video that we had shared. But because there are many narratives that shape values and are carried, that they shape the values that are linked to violence against women and are carried and transmitted through faith-based beliefs and systems, it's really important that we can engage those systems to inquire and challenge the beliefs that are harmful and that perpetuate gender inequality and these practices. There are actually some great initiatives that are involving faith-based and traditional actors that have shown to bring positive changes and results. And in the chat, I will put a link to that publication in case you are interested. It's been actually developed by the UN Trust Fund for Ending Violence Against Women, which is a joint UN granting fund. And what this shows is that initiatives can bring positive results when the faith-based actors themselves and the leaders themselves actually have the knowledge as well as the skills to reflect and change their own mindsets that might have bias and harmful social norms. And then they can also then be in a position to better challenge those norms. There's also a lot of opportunities to create dialogue, and it's an ongoing process that can challenge those norms using the existing practices and structures of faith-based institutions, such as the places of worship, such as the practices like sermons, prayers. And it's really important to engage them from the start so that that analysis of the problem, of the challenges, begins with their own analysis and then can be developed into tailored interventions and solutions to address the issue. So there's absolutely a lot of scope for that, some work underway, and I hope that you are able to engage with that literature and connect more to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Sunita. Rasmane, your response to the question, please.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Yeah, this is a very interesting question about what we can IMF do to inform policy decision-making in its member countries. So the IMF is supporting its member countries in several ways. First, as part of its mandate, the IMF is providing technical assistance to its member countries to improve their technical capacities and better inform their policy decision making. And in some country programs, there are some structural benchmarks that include gender equality issues. Second, economists at the IMF are doing some research to raise awareness of the importance of gender equality. And these work are often presented to policymakers. And finally, we are working with our partners, such as UN Women, organizing seminars and trainings together to help advance women's rights in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Rasmane. Mireille, would you be able to share your experiences on the question that was just posed to you? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. If I heard well, the question was if we have the specific gender law, the specific anti-GBV law. Yes, we do. It's a law number 59, stock 2008 that was elected on 10th September 2008 on prevention and punishment of gender-based violence.
Thank you. Okay, so let's move to the next round of questions. So for Sunita, there was a question from Ms. Josephine Irene Uwamaria. Her question was on monitoring and reporting. So monitoring and reporting of physical violence is often quite challenging as it sorely depends on the victim and is at the mercy of neighbors or friends and family members. How can this be revitalized from a rights perspective? And what about access to legal and other services to help support that? For Rasmane, a question for you. The effectiveness of laws is generally slow to materialize. So the commenter suggested to put more emphasis on girls' education to help them broaden their opportunities later in life. And then for Mireille, if you could speak to how digital transformation in Rwanda may be helping to tackle gender-based violence, and what is Rwanda's experience with using digitalization and helping to voice violence? Thank you.
Great, thanks for that. And I think when we're looking at reporting experiences of violence, whether physical, psychological, sexual, as well as help seeking, we know that most survivors will go to individuals that they trust over formal service providers, whether that's the health sector, legal, police, justice, et cetera. So while it's really critical that these services, these essential services, as we said earlier, are made available to those who need them and who want to use them, and to make them accessible. So knowing that each woman and girl, each survivor, whether if they're men or boys, all need to have services that are tailored to them, and that not all survivors have that same journey. Our focus really should be on expanding the options available. So as you said, maybe it's legal, other services, psychosocial, economic and financial assistance. So those should be the focus of our efforts in terms of expanding options available to survivors, rather than actually determining the path or trying to, increase numbers in a certain sector per se. Because we have to respect and support survivors who may decide that they don't want to report or go through formal services, because that might not be best for them on their individual journey to move forward from the experience. And that's their choice, that's their right. And so really, it is about making sure they know that the right that they do have a right to live free of violence, that what has happened to them is not their fault, because often we also know that individuals who experience violence face blame for that from their families, from societies, even from peers. And so addressing that blame, reducing those barriers at the same time as expanding the service options available to them will be, have the best options for improving their ability to move forward. And then as we're connecting also to listening to survivors and hearing that, that will also bring evidence of what has actually worked and has been successful. So the reporting might not always be through the number of cases reported at a particular space, although it's important to include that, and it's important to keep those spaces funded and available. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Yeah, regarding the question, the suggestion is that the effectiveness of laws is generally slow to materialize, and suggestion is to put more emphasis on the girls' education. I totally agree with that. Now, the issue is that even with higher level of education for women, it doesn't mean that gender-based violence will be eliminated. It could still happen for several reasons, perhaps that the men are physically strong, etc. So in this case, if violence happens, it is good that there are some legal provision in place to guarantee women access to justice for violence-related cases. I know some countries where it is even difficult to enact the law. So this will be the first step for these countries to adopt. The second step will be to make sure that the law is enforced. This is a very difficult step, but I still believe that having legal provisions in place is important. Thank you.
Thank you. The digital access now in Rwanda, when it comes to the mobile phone access, we do have above 60% of penetration in Rwanda, where using a mobile phone to spread information, where to report, when to report, how to get information is really easy for Rwandans, and it is helping to increase those numbers that we saw in the presentation. But also, it's not like going as a standalone approach. We have to mix it with other interventions, like the campaigns that we are conducting. And also, we do have the hotlines that are open. People calls for free, and they can report or they can ask for information. Different ministries that I showed in the presentation, they do have the toll-free lines where people are calling 24/7 to give, to seek for counseling, to report any case that they have encountered. We also use a lot the social media as a way of spreading the messages. Don't keep quiet. There is, it's your right to speak. It's your right to get services. It's your right to open up. So we are merging the interventions to make sure that victims feel not alone, that victims feel supported, so they can really support, seeking for the support. And also, as I mentioned, you have maybe heard the interventions that are implemented by some of the implementers, some of the stakeholders here in Rwanda. I would like to mention the I-Accelerator approach, where it's a challenge to young people to propose solutions and that respond to their need. And most of them are now being oriented in the digital ways of solving issues affecting young people, mainly in providing information on the sexual reproductive health and rights, also how to equip young people with knowledge in terms of sexuality education, where to get services, how to get counseling, in terms of making healthy and informed decisions. So the digital platforms are really helping a lot. And we have witnessed that we can't do much without taking that opportunity, especially in time of lockdown, where COVID was hitting the world. So we didn't have any other choice. and as we were promoting using the digital gadgets to maybe access the finance services, we were also promoting that usage to get health services, including the reports on GBV, and whenever you report, the medical team were really reaching to you because there was a challenge for movement. So we adapted to that in terms of providing information and in terms of inciting people to seek for information, for services, including reporting and getting counseling. I think I can stop from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mireille. Don't go too far. I have two more specific questions for you from the chat. So first, one of the questions was, could you tell us the extent to which the Isange one-stop centers are receiving direct national budget support? And then the second said, congratulations to Rwanda for having set up access houses for the protection and support of women victims of sexual violence. What can be the penalties for perpetrators of such crimes?
Yes, for the funding, as I mentioned, we have been implementing the Isange One-Stop Center program and the support from the donors. But as the last project phased out in 2019, now from 2022 and 2021, even today, all the funds are being dispersed on the government side. So we are now even in the exercise to see how we can make it really operational without relying on the outside support, because we saw it's really good. It's helping Rwandans to be open to report back any form of violence that is being committed to them, and especially for the youngest. And now we are like taking it fully at the government side, because we know, as Rosman said, it can't be dealt maybe only at program level. We know it's an issue of mindset. If we don't really think how we can deal with it with limited resources that countries have, like as Rwanda, the resources that we have, we know we will not achieve much. So we are now seeing how we can revise, not revise the Isange concept itself, but see how we can domesticate it and use the limited resource that we have, not really thinking the GBV prevention and response at program level and with the budget, the expense budget that it requires, but how can we put it with limited funds, and how can we still provide services with quality and with limited resources? That exercise is ongoing now, and we think we will really have an agreement and see how the government of Rwanda will take this up. About the penalties, it's really heavy, if I say that, and it depends on the conditions, because when you do the gender-based violence, it can take for the minima, it can take the imprisonment of 5 years. And when it comes to the sexual abuse to children under 14, it can go to the lifetime imprisonment. So it's no for the 20 years, But if it caused a death to the young child, or it resulted from a chronic disease to that young children, the sentence will be the lifetime imprisonment. So we are really tough with the penalties. And we now recently launched the sex offender registry, and we think it will discourage people to commit the GBV, the sexual abuse, especially against young girls and young boys. Thank you. I can share some documents on the law for them to get into articles and see what is really highlighted. Thank you.
Very helpful. Thank you. Thank you, Marie. So there are many more questions to be addressed. Let me throw out a few questions that are open to all the panelists. So one of the questions that came in was, what do you think could be some of the mechanisms in addressing gender-based violence in fragile and conflict states? And then a second question that any of you may want to answer is, how does one encourage men and boys to speak out if they are experiencing gender-based violence?
Okay, maybe I'll begin and then pass the floor to the other panelists. So each context is dynamic, but at the same time, we can still look at how the different components of a holistic process to address gender-based violence can still be relevant in conflicts. The issue becomes, how can those components be adapted? I had shared, the 6 components around the enabling environment, strengthening policies and institutions, investing in prevention, ensuring essential services are in place, investments in the data, both prevalence as well as administrative data, and strengthening and supporting women's movements and civil society grassroots organizations. So how do we adapt these to the specific context of conflicts? In these settings, it's especially critical to make sure that there is that engagement with civil society, community groups, women's rights organizations who are living at the center of conflict and crisis, because this recognizes that women and girls in humanitarian settings are more at risk of violence because of the heightened barriers that they face in that setting. But also, it's important to connect with them because it recognizes that because of that risk and a heightened vulnerability, they are also best placed to engage, to identify the solutions and craft, the response that will affect their lives. It's also important to remember that the need for services don't go away because someone is living in an area affected by conflict. And so making sure that services are agile, and I think we heard with you, Sange, in terms of thinking about adaptation and mobility, and even if it's in a development setting, how that could apply if we are taking it to a setting affected by conflict. And similarly, it's really important to retain attention to continuing to invest in prevention efforts, even in settings of conflict, because norms do change in times of transition like conflicts, but it also creates that opportunity to promote more equitable norms that can transform power imbalances and really challenge gender inequality, which actually hurts everyone. No one benefits from gender inequality. If you'd like to know more information, there have been standards and guidelines that have been developed around how to develop and implement programs around gender-based violence in emergencies from the Interagency Standing Committee, and I can share that in the chat box. But there's significant work that's been done on this, and still more that's coming up, but space to grow from. Thank you.
Thank you, Sunita. Rasmane or Mireille, anything to add on those 2 questions? If not, we certainly have some others that we could get to.
Thank you. Maybe I can touch on the issue of how men and boys can report, because in Rwanda, the law is very clear on that, because the GBV can be happening to the men, to the boys, to the women, to the young girls. But in most cases, we see numbers are higher than in men and girls than boys, than in men and boys. So we are like emphasizing on that narration, saying that everyone can be a candidate to the gender-based violence. So we provide trainings to the young boys on the issues of the GBV. In schools, they are part of the school clubs where they discuss the GBV item, the GBV matters. They see statistics of how many girls, how many boys, why are we talking, sorry, where we're talking mainly on girls, but we want to demystify that concept of GBV is girls or women's matter. It's for everyone. And we train healthcare providers, that multidisciplinary team, to provide a friendly service to everyone that is coming in to seek service. And as I said, the law is very clear. The article that defines GBV, it highlights everyone can face this. So when it comes to services, you even tailor services that are good for boys and for men, because we have the investigators that are men, that are women, that can speak to young boys that enters in the space. And with that mobilization, we go to the radio, we spread the information everywhere. We make sure that the gender issue is highlighted, that everyone can be a victim and everyone can be also a perpetrator if you don't really get well what you have to do in such cases. And also, we recently adopted a gender policy, adopted it in January 2021, where we focus on the men engage strategies. We have to really build that concept. And Rosman said it, women cannot go far without men allies. And we do understand that. So we need to transform young boys and men to be supporters and challenge that stereotypes that every man is a perpetrator. So if they want really to change that, they have to be among the champions, the he for she champions. So we are seeing men, boys being role models where they live in their communities. And if there is an issue, and the healthcare providers, the investigators, the legal, those who provide legal support are trained and they know men and boys can be victims. It's really helping a lot of number of men and young boys coming out for seeking the support. Thank you.
Thank you, Mireille. And again, it is an issue that affects everyone, and we have to think about that in those kinds of terms. So thank you for that very clear answer and explanation on what is being done in Rwanda to address this. So we are quickly running out of time. Unfortunately, we have time for, I think, maybe one last question that I'll just put out there, and then perhaps all panelists can answer it as well. Well, starting with Resman. Resman, what are the impacts of gender-based violence in low-income countries? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Lisa. I'm not aware of any study of the impact of gender-based violence on low-income countries. I mean, targeting only the sample of low-income countries. But there is one study by the World Bank done in 2018 with a very large sample of countries that we could share. And in this study, for example, we are assuming that the cost could be up to 3.7% of GDP. There are also some country cases like the one done on Ghana, showing that gender-based violence cost could reach 0.9% of GDP. So for the studies that we have done on sub-Saharan Africa, the sample is 18 countries, and around 80% of them are low-income countries. So it is a representative sample for low-income countries if you want that. So I will share the work by the World Bank. There are a lot of low-income countries included. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sunita, would you like to answer that question as well?
Sure, just to add that there are other studies that have been done, and I can again also share a couple links. But I think the trend that we'd see, similar to the trend that Rasman had shared, the costs are there, the consequences are there. They're not all, what we see in numbers is not the actual cost. And I think it's really important to remember that there's a lot that hasn't yet been counted, and therefore it's not, monetized, or it's not visible. And so that's where really recognizing all these invisible consequences and harms on our society. And as Mireille was saying, it affects all of us. All people, regardless of gender identity, are affected by gender-based violence and are also affected by inequality. There is no one wins with gender inequality. And so I think recognizing that in each specific setting, understanding the reach of the scope of the problem, understanding the factors across those different levels of the ecological model, the stories and the norms that shape or allow violence to continue, and the barriers that individuals face to access the services and access response is important, more than just looking for the monetary, the numbers from studies. So I think there are studies, and we can definitely share, but recognizing there are other ways to acknowledge and identify harms and seek solutions then, which all of those provide the entry points for creating the solutions to bring about transformative change. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. I think we're just about out of time, so let me wrap up today's session by again thanking Maxime, Ratna, Sunita, Rasmane, and Mireille for their remarks and their presentations. I think we have all learned quite a bit and are all very motivated to continue working on this. Let me also thank the audience for your active participation and your thought-provoking questions this morning or this afternoon. As we go forward, let us all keep front and center in our minds the personal stories that we've heard, the aggregate statistics, the economic costs, and importantly, the successful policies and programs that can be used to address gender-based violence. There is, of course, much work to be done, but each of us in our individual and professional capacities can play a meaningful role in working to eradicate gender-based violence. So thank you again, and I look forward to continuing the conversation with all of you.